Well, a very good morning to you all. This is a briefing on Operation Causeway, which was that one time in World War II when the United States almost invaded Taiwan. Next slide, please. So I know many of you have been to the Naval War College, and I would hazard to guess that all of you at some point in your career, you're all going to visit, either to study or to participate in a workshop, training, or a war game. And when you do, you are going to go across one of the most beautiful bridges in America. It's called the Clybourne-Pell Bridge. That bridge, ladies and gentlemen, has a direct connection to World War II and the plan to invade Taiwan. Next slide. The connection is in the namesake. So Senator Pell, one of Rhode Island's most famous senators, who the bridge is named after, before he was a senator, he was Ensign Pell. He fought in the Mediterranean theater of the war. He was recognized as being very good at what he did, gifted, and so he was selected to be part of a top secret unit that worked undercover on the campus of Columbia University in New York City, collecting all source intelligence, collating it, and preparing plans for the invasion, and especially for this particular unit, the occupation and the post-battle governance of Taiwan. And to give you a sense of the detail that they went into, this was a multi-year process. They had civil affairs handbooks that they handed out to officers for every single city in Taiwan. They had worked out what the currency system was going to be like in the occupation phase. They had worked out how they were going to rebuild the legal system, because Taiwan, unlike other islands that were invaded in World War II in the Pacific, had a very large civilian population. Over 6 million people lived there. They anticipated an absolutely brutal battle that would go on for months. And as they were seizing territory, they were going to have to rebuild the entire society from the ground up. And so they went into great detail to prepare for that. Why? You guys know your history of World War II, and you know that in general, operations were unfolding so quickly around the world that it was very unusual to spend years preparing for any particular operation. This was an absolutely extraordinary effort. The reason it was so extraordinary is because the planned operation itself was so extraordinary. Had this actually occurred, it would have been the single largest amphibious operation in the Pacific theater in World War II. It would have been so colossal, so titanic in scale, that it would have rivaled and probably surpassed the D-Day landings in Normandy, France. We now know, with historical hindsight, that had this actually happened, had it gone forward to plan, it would have been the single largest sea, air, land engagement in human history. But after years of training and preparation and standing up specialized units just for this, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, at the 11th hour, the last minute before this was about to go into motion, they canceled it. It was aborted. Why? It was one of the most important political, military command decisions in World War II, and most people have never heard about it. And it matters because if we want to understand why the world is the way that it is today, how we got here, and why certain flashpoints are located where they are on the map, we have to understand this history. This was the ultimate fork in the road. The cancellation of Operation Causeway completely changed the strategic complexion of the last year of the war in the Pacific, and it had after effects that reverberated throughout time that we are now still living with 80 years on. Next slide, please. But it's much easier said than done when you talk about trying to understand what happened and why it happened. It's really only very recently, like in the last year or so, that we've been able to collect and put together a critical mass of evidence in the form of all the declassified documents from the war that got scattered. Most of it was burned for security after the war, but what survived was scattered. And so you have to go to College Park, Maryland, to the National Archives and do a lot of digging. You have to go to the Naval War College and go into our archives and go into Iron Mountain and pull stuff out. You have to go to the Army War College at Carlisle. And if you piece that together, you get part of the picture, but only part of it. The rest you can get from Taiwan, from primary and secondary Chinese language sources that we've gotten a hold of, from the Taiwanese military and from historians, and actually from archaeologists in Taiwan that have, after years and years of many of these bunker sites, for example, were off limits. Some of them have finally started to open up, and people, archaeologists, have gone in and they've started to map them out. And you can finally start to piece together what happened and why this operation was ultimately aborted. And it matters a great deal now because we are looking for any possible insight that we can get into for the question of deterrence. There's great concern that the People's Republic of China could invade Taiwan in the near to mid future. So the question is, how do we prevent that from happening? How do we deter that? Well, we have a very real historical case study of a time when a much stronger power planned to invade Taiwan that had much weaker defenses, and yet the defenders were able to successfully deter the world's strongest military and strongest navy. How did they do that? What in the world happened? Next slide. So to answer that question, we have to turn back the dial and go back into time. So planning for the invasion of Taiwan, notional planning and notional intelligence collection in support of it started right after Pearl Harbor. Right after Pearl Harbor, there was a very small group of Taiwan experts that were placed in the munitions building and then into the Pentagon, and then ultimately some of them ended up at Columbia University where Senator Pell served. And they started to prepare. By the summer of '42, they were working on the psychological warfare plan to undermine the Imperial Japanese government, which is a military government in Taiwan. By the summer of '43, when the U.S. military started to go on the offensive across the Pacific, the Allied leaders, the top political leaders, so our President FDR, President Roosevelt, got together with Prime Minister Churchill and Prime Minister Mackenzie King in Quebec, and they sat down with the combined chiefs, so all the top generals and admirals, and they started to map out an endgame for winning World War II, not only in Europe, but also in the Pacific. They didn't know how long the war might go on. They assumed it might go into 46 or 47, but they wanted to have a vision for how it would end. And they developed that strategic vision. And that strategic vision that they came up with was for U.S. forces to march across the Pacific in two lines of effort in an island hopping campaign that would culminate in the Taiwan Strait. U.S. forces would seize Taiwan, and they would seize a port in China on the other side of the Taiwan Strait, and they would use that for an anchorage for the entire Pacific Fleet. They would turn the entire area into a giant web of bomber bases for B-29 strategic bombers. They would blockade the Japanese home islands, completely cutting them off from all of their resources, especially oil, but all of their resources that were coming into the home islands from Southeast Asia. They would bomb the home islands. And then if the emperor still refused to surrender, what they would have done is they would have mounted the invasion forces for Operation Downfall, the planned final invasion of the Japanese home islands. Those would have been mounted in Taiwan and launched from Taiwan. Next slide, please. So I mentioned the munitions building. So this is what Washington, D.C. looked like in World War II, where you had all these temporary buildings where all this planning effort was going on because the Pentagon was still under construction at that time. And so this is where the early efforts would have gone on. One of the many products that you can find in the archives is what was, this is Janus 87. This is the Joint Army-Navy Intelligence Study of Taiwan. It's actually an encyclopedia. This is one of the most magnificent all source, it's mostly open source, but all source intelligence products that you will ever find. It's incredible what they were able to do. You had OSS officers, for example, the predecessor to CIA officers, spread out across the country. They visited anybody and any man and his dog who had ever stepped foot in Taiwan got a knock on their door. They went to college campuses. They went to State Department. They went to Canada to talk to missionaries that had been to Taiwan. They talked to Polish immigrants who had been there on a stop-off on their merchant ship. They talked to fur traders. They talked to former diplomats, anybody they could find, and they interviewed them. They reached out to the British SIS counterparts to have them interview people, because for most of the 1920s and 1930s, the Empire of Japan treated Taiwan, and especially key military areas, as off limits. It was very difficult to find photographs of things that you might want to bomb, for example, or to find information on people, the key people that you might want to turn and have as collaborators, or key people that you're going to want to hunt down and put in POW camps in this operation. They collected all of that. It was absolutely magnificent. And you can read these products. It's an encyclopedia. It's a whole bookshelf of different products that they produced there in these buildings, and then ultimately at Columbia University as well. And the operation finally came to Nimitz's desk in early 1944. Next slide. So Admiral Nimitz got the order from the Joint Chiefs of Staff in March of 44 to actually start this thing rolling. This was his chief war planner, Admiral Forrest Sherman, and together they put together this plan that would have rivaled the D-Day landings in scope and size. It was incredibly ambitious. It was remarkable. And one of the most remarkable things about it is the way that Admiral Nimitz would start building a plan, and then he would float it. And then he would ask for more and more inputs. And you can see the message traffic that went back and forth as all the best and the brightest, all of his top commanders would respond to any question that he had. And then you would get these really interesting debates and opinions from all the giants, really, of World War II in the Pacific. And then that built up the plan. And it got modified over time. And we can look at different cuts of the plan as it evolved. And this is what it looked like, the preliminary draft. Next slide. So the plan called for starting the invasion of Taiwan in the south. So they surveyed all of Taiwan's invasion beaches. They looked for where they could land and how they could do it. And they were going to start down here. This would have been D-Day, and it was set for February 15th, 1945. And then on D+20, if things had gone to plan, they would have seized Xiamen Bay on the other side of the Taiwan Strait, directly across from Taipei. And they would have formed a perimeter line about 20 miles inside, and that would have provided safe harbor for the entire U.S. Pacific Fleet. Next slide. The invasion force that they stood up was called 10th Army. This was remarkable. It was a field army made up of 3 corps. Nimitz and Sherman wanted 4 corps if they could get it, but they ended up settling for 3 corps, and it was joint. It was joint Army, Navy, Marine divisions that would go in, supported by Navy Seabees and others. They had their own tactical air. And so if you look at these patches, you will see all 6 of the U.S. Marine Corps divisions in World War II were going to take part in this, and almost all of the key Army amphibious units were going to take part in this. One of the things that made 10th Army so remarkable, and it was headquartered at Schofield Barracks in Oahu, just north of Pearl Harbor, what made it so different was that they specialized in amphibious warfare, they specialized in urban warfare, And they also specialized in civil affairs because, again, you've got 6 million civilians that you have to be able to take care of after you come in and completely shatter the island. It was backed by incredible logistics support. And the stockpiling for this operation started at ports in San Francisco and LA and Seattle. And the buildup, and they formed entire new divisions from scratch. And they trained these guys up specific for this operation. When President Roosevelt went out to visit Hawaii in 1944, in that summer, he was briefed on this, and he actually saw demonstrations. So he did the standard drive-by where all the guys march on the parade grounds, but they also did a demonstration for him where they had built a mock Japanese urban area, and then they went in with flamethrowers and they showed what urban operations were going to look like so the president could see it. That was all Taiwan. Next slide. Had it gone to plan, it would have centered on Kaohsiung. Kaohsiung is Taiwan's largest port city. It still is to this day, and it was then. It was important to seize that as fast as possible because even though you had a beachfront that was about 50 miles long, where you could land a good 6 divisions in a day, most of that was backed by very large lagoons. Once they land, a lot of the soil was non-trafficable. The bridges and the roads are going to be cut. And so what do? How do you unload the tanks? How do you unload all the heavy equipment, this mountain of supplies that you need to get onto the island as fast as humanly possible so you can support what is going to be an incredibly intense operation? You need a port. And so they selected the port of Kaohsiung, and the plan was to have a 3-pronged attack where they would land to the north and the south of the port, and they would have a pincer movement around the port to seize it as fast as possible. They knew the Japanese were going to blow up the port and deny it to them. So they also had a very large second and then third and then fourth echelon of engineers and support that are going to come in to rebuild it as fast as they can. Next slide. This, of course, is a picture of Iwo Jima, and that's Mount Suribachi in the background. If you go just south of the port of Kaohsiung, the beach that they were going to land on, one of the main beaches, looked a lot like that. And in the background, there's a mountain on Taiwan that dominates the port of Kaohsiung, that entire operational area. It's called Ape Hill, Shoshan. And it looks a lot like that. The difference, of course, is that Mount Suribachi was about 550 feet high. Ape Hill is about 1,200 feet high, twice as high. It absolutely dominates that whole area. And then there's Banping Hill that backs it. So if you take the high-speed rail, the bullet train, down to Kaohsiung, when you stop there and you look out your window, you see it. These were entirely honeycombed with bunkers. They were hollowed out in preparation. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But I present this picture to you because that's something like what it would have looked like if Taiwan had been invaded. Next slide. This is not something I wrote about in the report that we published on this in October, but it's something I wanted to share with you guys because I know this is what you do. This operation, just like the D-Day landings, had cover. It needed cover. If the Japanese knew where the divisions were going to land, then they can concentrate and they can be there waiting. And as soon as the Marines come ashore, the defenders pounce on them before they can get a solid foothold. And then massacre could ensue. And so they needed a deception plan. And it needed to be really, really good. And so they brought in OSS and Wild Bill Donovan. They were going to bring in Douglas Fairbanks Jr., who was, if you're from the Navy, he was one of the fathers of naval special warfare. He was a movie star. His dad was a movie star, played Zorro. He was a movie star. And movie stars, as you might imagine, tend to be gifted when it comes to deception. And he was. He set up the beach jumper unit. And if you're not familiar with it, there's some really interesting reading that you can do on what they did. But essentially it was psychological warfare and it was deception. They could take out a team of small, fast boats and simulate using sound effects, using lights, using smoke, using all kinds of Hollywood magic. They could simulate multiple divisions parked off the coast. And so the defenders think that there are multiple divisions out there that are coming in, and then they start to get ready and they start to concentrate forces. Well, guess what? The actual attack's going to happen 15, 20, 50 miles to the south or to the north. It's not happening here. But this is where the lights and the action and the radio deception is going on. This is what they did. In addition, they were going to drop the Oscars, or what the British called the Ruperts. These were the dummy paratroopers. If you've seen Band of Brothers, right? Where they drop in and they blow up and everybody's all confused. And what's all this gunfire that's going on here? And why are there paratroopers falling out of the sky here? And to sow as much chaos as possible behind enemy lines, to throw them off balance right away, and to convince them that you're going to land in a place you're not going to land. They also had an OSS sabotage plan. They had plans for special operations, special forces raids, airborne raids to knock out key bridges so that the Japanese couldn't reinforce their defenses around the Kaohsiung area. Next slide. Had it gone to plan, this entire area from the beaches down here, these are very rugged mountains, to this whole flatlands would have been taken over by D+15. That would have been cleared. The Japanese had a great network of air bases that would have been seized and expanded and turned into B-29 bases. But before they could do that, of course, they would need bases for tactical air, because even though this whole operation would have been covered by about 17 big fleet Essex-class aircraft carriers and, I don't know, I think just as many, if not more, smaller baby carriers, they were going to have trouble. And they didn't know how long the air cover could stay on station, so they needed to seize those air bases very quickly. Next slide. So D-Day, and this river is a beast. And you can see the estimates of the situation, the G2 out there at Schofield Barracks talking about that river and trying to game out how they're going to get across the river and the pontoon bridges, and the way the Japanese could manipulate some of this favorable terrain, and how they're going to deal with it. So again, they were going to land about 3 divisions here, 3 divisions here, another division on this little, or another, I think it would have been a reinforced battalion here, 2 more here. They would have had 2 divisions in floating reserve. There would have been another 3 Marine Corps divisions that would have then landed here on D+20. But what's nice about that? What's nice about that is if things don't go to plan here, you now have an extra 3 Marine divisions that we're going to go here, and now you can bring them in to either do an envelopment, to land up here, to leapfrog up, or to reinforce and make another surprise landing. Next slide. But of course we know it was aborted. Why? What happened? Well, one of the things that happened was intelligence on Taiwan got better and better as the war went on. You had the radio intelligence, right? We were intercepting Japanese communications. And so they're able to start to piece together the Japanese order of battle on the island. You had more and more photo reconnaissance flights. OSS might have been able to get a little bit of human intelligence on the island. And what they started to see in the summer of '44 is that the Japanese were reinforcing Taiwan. What they also saw at the Battle of Saipan is the Japanese were not going to surrender. And they were perfectly happy to kill huge numbers of civilians as well. It was something in Chinese is called shattered jade. I'm not sure what it is in Japanese, but it's a euphemism for everybody dies. We're all in this fight together, and man, women, children, dog, everybody dies. We all fight, and we all fight until the bitter end. The shattered jade strategy is that they consider themselves as children of the emperor. They were all sacred jewels, and they would rather shatter the jewels than have it fall in the hands of this, the barbaric enemy, right? They were incredibly well indoctrinated. And so there was this key moment here. So these are the key decision makers. So Admiral Nimitz, Admiral Spruance. Admiral Spruance was the naval commander in charge of Causeway. Admiral Buckner was in charge of the ground fight. Admiral Spruance was in charge of the overall amphibious force. And there's their boss in the middle. Hot-tempered, tough, unpleasant, Ernest King, back in Washington, D.C. He was the CNO. He was the Chief of Naval Operations. He also made himself the Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Navy in the war, and he was the most powerful member of the four-man Joint Chiefs of Staff when it came to the war in the Pacific. He dominated it. And so what he said was very, very influential, and he loved the idea of seizing Taiwan. He was all about it. This was really his idea for how you win the war. But this intelligence starts to come in that the Japanese are reinforcing. They're reinforcing. They're pulling in divisions from Manchuria. They're pulling their elite division off of Okinawa to reinforce Taiwan. The defenses appear to be much more formidable than were expected. When they started planning Operation Causeway, the Japanese garrison in Taiwan was 20,000. By the summer of 44, it had crept up to 35,000. But then in September, they get new intel. Now it's in the 80,000 range, and it keeps climbing. There's this moment aboard the USS Indianapolis. That was Admiral Spruance's flagship, where they park off of Saipan. And the bodies are still warm on the island. And these three senior leaders go tour the battlefield. And they see what had just happened on Saipan. They see what the horrors of these kinds of battles can look like. And they especially see the civilian toll. Because Saipan was the first island battle where you actually had a significant number of civilians that were on island, and that all got wiped out. This picture was taken on deck after they had toured the island. They go inside, they sit down with their staff officers for a nice meal, and they start talking about Operation Causeway. Now, I can't tell you with 100% confidence that that's the focus of their meal, but we know that day they talked about Operation Causeway. I'm about 80 to 90% sure it was at that meal, because I don't know when else in their schedule they could have done it. So they're having this meal. The first course is served. The second course is served. Then the dessert course. And in the dessert course, all of a sudden, through all the portholes and the doors, fly swarms, hundreds of thousands of big, fat flies that swarm in. And they land on all of the food, and they get in their hair. They get all over. And so you've got these admirals that suddenly sit up, and there's chairs scraping on the floor, and they're, what is this? It completely ruins the end of the meal. What was so horrifying about that is they knew where those flies came from. It was all the dead bodies on the beaches. And the flies had blown out to sea about a mile out where they were parked and spoiled the meal. Now, if you're the superstitious type, you might say, well, that's a really bad omen, right? It was certainly a bad omen for the USS Indianapolis, if you're familiar with the history of that ship and what happened after it delivered the atomic bomb to Tinian, which is not far from Saipan, and how it ended up sinking, radio silence, and how many of the guys got eaten by sharks. But you could also say it was a really bad omen for Operation Causeway, and it certainly got the wheels turning in Admiral Spruance's head. A week later, here we have Admiral Nimitz in Honolulu briefing the president's chief advisor, Admiral Leahy, and MacArthur General MacArthur, of course, was a towering figure in World War II and the war in the Pacific. He hated the idea of Causeway because he saw it as competition for Operation Mike, which is planned operation to not only land at Leyte Gulf, which he did, but then to convince the Joint Chiefs of Staff to seize Luzon, the northernmost island of the Philippines. And because resources were so thin and there were only so many divisions available, there was a huge debate. Who gets these crack divisions? And when do you get them? And when do you get the logistics and the transport and the paratroopers and everything else that they need? And MacArthur didn't want to give an inch. And so there was this remarkable moment that summer where they're debating in front of the President of the United States. And the Joint Chiefs are split. And so you have FDR getting different debates from his senior leaders, and then also visiting the Jungle Warfare School and touring the 7th Army Division and everything that went on. And you know what the president said? And again, bearing in mind that the president and all the Allied political leaders, Churchill and Mackenzie King, they had been talking about this for over a year. This was something that everybody had a strong opinion about. He said, I want the unified opinion of my top military commanders. I'm not going to step in. This is not a political decision for me. Well, there was no unified opinion, and the debate dragged out for months after this, until finally Admiral Spruance stood up at a planning conference in September of 44, when General Buckner, the ground force commander, is giving a briefing on here's our plan for Causeway and here's my commander's estimate of the situation. Admiral Spruance, who was the hero of the Battle of Midway, who was known for being very quiet and withdrawn. He's from Iowa, and people used to say he was icy because he grew up in Iowa, which is so cold in the wintertime. He stood up and he completely disrupted the briefing. And so everyone is looking this way at General Buckner. He's got the maps up and everything. And Admiral Spruance said, no, look at this wall. Look at this map. Here's what we're going to do. We don't have the division. And everybody turned in their seats and they were just shocked that Spruance would do something like this. And he said, here's what we're going to do. We don't have the divisions to take Taiwan. We just simply don't. They're not available. The Joint Chiefs of Staff had made Europe the priority theater. They're getting at least 70% of all resources, all divisions are all going to Europe. We're not getting the mountain division that we want for Taiwan. We're not getting the armored division that we want for Taiwan. We're not getting the logistics. We don't have enough Seabees. We don't have all these things. There's a long laundry list of things that they needed to pull this off at an acceptable price. We're getting reports from Howell and Mad Smith that our ratios are completely off. The ratios we use successfully to have superiority on Tarawa and Kwajalein and Saipan, those ratios are completely thrown off now because the Japanese have reinforced the way they have. So what do? We take the Taiwan invasion force, we take 10th Army, and we break it into two pieces. The small part, one of the corps, they're going to go after Iwo Jima, Operation Detachment. The other two corps, they're going to go after Okinawa instead, Operation Iceberg. We will end up getting, this was his argument, we will end up getting the same strategic benefits from these smaller islands that we would get from Taiwan. We'll still be able to mount the invasion forces for Japan. We'll still be able to have our bomber bases. We'll still be able to blockade the Japanese home island. And guess what? We can just bomb Taiwan. We just bottle them up. If we know the Japanese have a huge garrison there, just knock out their ports, knock out their airfields. They're not going anywhere. Fewer guys we got to fight. And we can save a lot of civilian lives in the process. He was able to successfully convince Nimitz, who then finally flew in early October of 44 to San Francisco, and they had this long multi-day debate between Nimitz and his boss. And finally, Admiral King called it off. At the 11th hour, the next day, or maybe 2 days later, flies back to DC, and they issue the orders for Operation Detachment and Operation Iceberg, and history changed at that point completely. Next slide. The Japanese, though, of course, did not know that this decision had been reached. They considered Taiwan an unsinkable aircraft carrier. It was vital to all of their plans. It was the linchpin, it was the fulcrum of all of their plans, all the strategic lines of communication. It was where they had launched the invasion of the Philippines to begin with on December 7, 1941, then December 8th because of the jet lag. It was where they had trained the guerrillas that they had inserted into Burma to undermine the British. And Malaya, Malaysia, and Indonesia. Taiwan was where their jungle warfare center was. It was where all the pilots who hit us at Pearl Harbor, that's where they trained. It was the fulcrum. And so for them, the key to the defense of Taiwan was air bases. And they built a ton of them. At its height, there were 67 air bases on Taiwan and on all the surrounding little islands. Some of them were decoys, some of them were real, but they were built in such a way where photographic intelligence would think they were decoys. So they're camouflage. Can you imagine trying to camouflage an entire air base? They were hollowed out, so they had deep reserves of everything you would need: fuel, ammo, spare parts. Every single one of them was fortified. They had garrisons protecting them. It was said that the network, it was this absolute web of air bases, was so thick that a pilot could get in his Zero fighter plane, he could take off, and by the time he had retracted his landing gear, he was already over another airfield. It was that dense. And a lot of those guys, of course, were kamikazes. Next slide. So they had a lot of kamikaze pilots in Taiwan. They also had a lot of kamikaze suicide boat squadrons that they had set up in Taiwan. I think there was about 600 fast boats in total that were there. They had mined all of the approaches to the island, and especially where the major amphibious effort was going to be. Over 10,000 mines. They had also dug these big tank traps, and they had fortified the beaches with obstacles and pillboxes and gun emplacements. Next slide. This is a map after the war when Chiang Kai-shek's forces took over Taiwan, and they started to survey, all right, what do we got here? Because the Japanese it turned a bloodless surrender, right? What do you do? Well, let's survey this. Let's go in there and check it out. So this was a map of the survey work and all the bunker networks that they discovered, that the Japanese had absolutely honeycombed all of Taiwan. And they had done such a good job when it comes to camouflage, concealment, and deception that even though photo reconnaissance flights were going over Taiwan all of the time from October of 44 until the end of the war, they were still missing stuff. So you can go back and you can read the intel take now. And it's really interesting. So there's this one report that we estimate there are 7 long-range artillery guns, for example, on Ape Hill, that big mountain there that dominates the entire operational area where Causeway would have taken place. Well, it turned out there were 67 long-range artillery guns that were there. How do you hide a giant howitzer? 155. Well, one of the ways they would hide them, if you're familiar with what they did in Peleliu and also on Iwo Jima, they would tunnel out cliff faces, and they would have giant steel doors, and then then those doors would be closed. There'd be vines hanging across it. When the invasion ships approached, what they would do is they would open the door, they would roll out the artillery, they would fire, and then they would pull it back in, close the door. And so they had a lot of nasty surprises waiting to meet the invasion. There were over 180 total long-range artillery guns in that area. They called it the Takao. Takao was the old-timey way of saying Kaohsiung, the Kaohsiung fortified zone. They had built fortified zones all over the place like that. They had also hidden the number of defenders. They had mobilized all the civilians, including the Formosan subjects. So Taiwan was a colony of the Empire of Japan from 1895, when they invaded it, onwards. During most of the war, you had small specialized Taiwanese units. Especially the Aboriginal units were famous for being the best jungle warfare units in the Japanese Empire. But the vast majority of Taiwanese didn't fight. Some volunteered for engineering duties, and so they would get captured on some of the small islands out in the Pacific, and then they would be interviewed by OSS officers and G2 types. And you can read the lists of questions that they had, because of course they were getting ready for Operation Causeway. But it wasn't until the end of the war, that last year, when emergency orders were issued to start this mega project. And it's interesting, the timing, because what did I say? Nimitz got the order from the Joint Chiefs of Staff in March of '44 to start things really rolling. That same month, even though the Japanese had not broken any of the American codes whatsoever, they were blind, they were able to correctly infer that Saipan was going to get hit, they're going to lose the Marianas, and if that happens, which happened a few months later in July, if that happens, Taiwan's going to be the next target. Because they were able to correctly infer that, they had emergency orders that were issued to their garrison, and they started what was an absolute mega project to fortify the island and to harness all of the latent power that was there in preparation, which is what they did. Next slide. Okay, so why does this history matter? Other than it might be interesting to think about an alternative history and the road not traveled, and ooh, that was never written about in our history textbooks, and wonder why, right? What happened there? Okay, that's kind of interesting, but it matters today, and it's really interesting because of this. Our top military and intelligence officials are expressing public concern that the People's Republic of China could invade Taiwan. And everything that we see, even on the open source side, suggests that they're deadly serious about preparing for this operation. And the Taiwanese, of course, can see it too. This is a quote from Admiral Li Shiming's book on the overall defense concept. In the eyes of many of those who know this problem the best and who have access to the most exquisite intelligence available, it may no longer be a question of if China is going to invade Taiwan or attack Taiwan in some other sneaky way, but a question of when they're going to do it and how they're going to do it. Next slide. And so that means it behooves us to think about the problem of deterrence. How do we prevent that from happening in the first place? Today, there are 24 million people that live in Taiwan. It is the single most successful liberal democracy in Asia, according to the Economist Intelligence Unit and a number of human rights-focused NGOs in Washington, D.C. and London. They survey countries around the world and they say, listen, Taiwan's an absolute gem. It's the freest country in Asia. So not only is it very important for semiconductors and a lot of other reasons, it's important for this. How do we prevent this place from being shattered? How do we stop that? Well, that's deterrence. I don't know about you guys. When I think of deterrence, I think of RAND reports. And you guys know how they read, right? They're expensive and they're dry, right? In Dr. Strangelove, it's the Bland Corporation. Well, it kind of is bland, and it's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant what these guys did, which is sheer brain power in the 1950s and 1960s. But it can seem so incredibly abstract. And often it is. We've never seen a nuclear war before. We don't know how it would play out. We don't know what conventional nuclear dynamics would look like. We have zero data to go on. So we can just work on hypotheticals and what is logical and what is rational and what might happen in different. We don't have to do that, is what I'm saying when it comes to Taiwan. Is we have a case in history where deterrence has already happened and it's already been successful. And so we might, if we're lucky, we might be able to draw from this historical case study, treat it like a living laboratory of what are the key lessons here? What are things that the Empire of Japan did right to defend Taiwan and to deter this invasion in World War II? And we now know they also did some other things right that had the invasion gone forward, it would have been an absolute bloodbath. How did they do that? And what might we learn from that today? And so here I've got a bit of a laundry list. The key one, of course, is that deterrence worked before, it can work again. And there's a lot of different ways that we might be able to maximize Taiwan's defensibility going forward. And if we're really smart, we can not only maximize its defensibility such that at the tactical level, the PLA is going to arrive there one day and they're going to be in for it. There's going to be some really, really unpleasant surprises waiting for them. That's great. That's important. Even better, though, is if you can get in their headspace, because deterrence ultimately happens in the 6 inches between our ears, especially in the enemy leader's ears. Today, that's Xi Jinping. If we can get in his headspace and figure out how to convince him not to do this thing in the first place, well, then we win without fighting. Next slide. So this is an example of Director Sharman mentioned the work that we do. This is an example of things that we like to geek out on. It is one of Taiwan's professional military journals. This is from their Combat Engineer Journal. They also have a Special Forces Journal. They have Armored Journal. They have all the things. They're all interesting. This is one of my favorite. I don't know why. I just like to geek out on fortifications, I guess, and beach defenses. And they do that. And so you can read the writings of Taiwanese military officers who know that the future of their country is at stake, and this is an existential threat that they face, and they are writing and they're debating, because it's a liberal democracy. They don't all agree with each other, and they don't have to agree with each other. They don't have to follow a party line, and they can debate ideas for the defense of Taiwan. And so these are some of the ideas. And one of them is, hey, we can learn. We can learn from what the Japanese did, and we can bring back some of that infrastructure. Some of it they kept, and some of it's still operational today, some of those gigantic bunker complexes, but a lot of them, well, they atrophied over time. And especially as Taiwan became a liberal democracy, they started to cut the size of their military. And so they lost some of that capability. The question is, how do you bring it back? Next slide. So if you guys would like to learn more, this is a report that we published in October of last year. There's a lot more in there. Would be honored if you'd take a look at it. Next slide. And then with that, this concludes the formal briefing. This is all the slides that I have for you guys. But let me just say thank you for everything you're doing to keep our nation safe. And thank you, President Brister, for the tremendous honor and privilege of being able to share this research with you guys. Thank you.
So we'll open it up to questions. Anyone want to fire one off up front? I guess I'll ask one. Looking at the top right-hand picture, you're talking about mobilization and different Taiwanese units preparing the domestic population for resistance operations. Can you kind of talk about what you've seen? I think it was the Kuna Academy.
Yeah, the Kuma Academy.
Right. Could you kind of like outline what preparations are being made for mobilization? And
yeah, absolutely. So here's the thing about Taiwan, is it because it's such a liberal democracy and because they're fiscally sensitive, they have cut the size of their standing military. And they've cut it pretty low now. So their standing military is about 180,000 strong. On a per capita basis, they look better than a lot of our European allies, much better in some cases. most of our Asian allies as well. But when you look at the threat that they face, their military is way too small. It really is. And some of their elite units, like their Marines and their military police command, their MPs are a little different than our MPs. They specialize in urban warfare. Those guys are crack units. They also have been cut. And so what do they do? And what do you do in that kind of environment where you've got a parliament, a Congress that says, hey, we want everybody to have universal health care, really, really high quality health care and education, all the rest of it. What they have done is they have tried to grow their reserve force. But reservists in Taiwan, well, every eligible male, which is most of their male population, they get some training, they get some military training. They usually do 4 months of boot camps. They learn how to shoot, and that's really about it. And it's from a static position. Why? Because they're going to have a lot of trenches, and they're going to need dudes in those trenches, and different static positions for the invasion force. So all their maneuver forces can do all the things that they're going to do when the invaders arrive. It's not even close to enough, though. And people in Taiwan realize it. And when Ukraine was invaded 3 years ago this week, that shocked people in Taiwan. Taipei 101, what for a while was the highest tower in the world, they had giant pictures of the Ukrainian flag on digital screens on the tower and on city blocks all over Taiwan. We stand with Ukraine because we know first Ukraine, next Taiwan. And one of the key lessons, and one of the key takeaways is the importance of mobilizing civilians, training civilians, getting their headspace right to support military operations, allowing them to be patriotic. Because for a long time, it wasn't cool to be patriotic. It wasn't cool to be nationalistic, right? And so there are outfits like Kuma Academy, where you have, it's really interesting, Taiwan's second largest semiconductor company, these guys that make all the chips that run our smartphones and really cool screens like this one. He got out of the game. He's a billionaire. And he got really angry at the Chinese Communist Party and the threats that Taiwan faces. And so he said, you know what I'm going to do with my wealth? I'm going to start establishing places, they're called the Kuma Academy, the Black Bear Academy for the Formosan or the Taiwanese black bear, where I'm going to train people. And they're going to learn about the threat that faces our country, and they're going to learn about basic wartime first aid. How do you treat burns? How do you stop the bleed? How do you identify friendly troops and enemy troops? All kinds of things like that. The military in Taiwan at first was a little shaken by this. They're like, no, that's our lane in the road. It's very paternalistic. It's like, yeah, Big Brother's got this. You guys, thanks, but no thanks. We don't really need you getting in our way. More recently, with the new president of Taiwan, President Lai, William Lai, this is much more acceptable politically because they realize how desperately they need these kinds of capabilities. And so there are a number of different, basically civil NGOs that are standing up in Taiwan. You also have, because Taiwan has very strict gun control laws, the only time you usually get to fire a gun is when you're doing your reserve duty. You can't buy one. So they have airsoft outfits that get together and they practice how do you maneuver in buildings and how do you, even if it's very fake and very lightweight kind of stuff. So at least folks, and these of course are all fake pistols, so people have some sense of what to do. And what's remarkable is the number of office workers, you'll note that dude's belly, the number of people that come out and they get ready on their own time. Even elderly people now are taking these courses in Taiwan. It's a really remarkable effort that goes on. And to this day, as was the case 80 years ago, actually over 100 years ago, it's still the Aboriginals in Taiwan. It's about 2% now of the population they are still the hardest, the best warriors that Taiwan has. Over 50% of Taiwan's soft community, I think it's well over 50%, are Aboriginals. And same with their Marine Corps as well. These guys are really, as I understand it, they're the real deal. You guys would be able to judge that better. But from what I've heard, they're tough. And they're now also involved, especially the retired guys, in training the next generation for this fight. Yes, sir.
Willow here from the J5. So I was fortunate enough to go to Taiwan to support the Taiwan's exercise last year. Red Blue, got to see everything, and you're right about the geography. Obviously, you've been there. A question going back to the decision to back away, and I'm going to put it in the context of kind of our own thinking here at this level, right? If you could speak to a little more about, right, the fundamentals of planning, right, time, space, force, and obviously some things changed as Intel came in, on how either those external variables from the information of the Japanese, or was it more lack of forces and, wrapping up World War II? And I'm just thinking in the context of, as we look to either have a purpose-built force, right? So let's say, and that's what Rich Colby is proposing. If he gets confirmed for USD policy, the strategy of denial and removing and prioritizing the theater, downsizing in Europe. You see what's going on with whatever happens with Ukraine. So I'm just thinking about some of this decision making that occurred then, and the balancing of strategy between the two theaters, and specifically this case. I don't know if you could tease out a little more about some of those details that occurred over those couple months in that debate that you referenced, and maybe how that would apply to the very real changing nature that's occurring in the past 30 days, that will occur in the next 30 days. And then as we as the department craft new planning guidance, get the new NDS and other things, and some things that we could potentially look for in this historical example as trade-off spaces that would be ongoing.
That's a great question. So, yeah, they're all good. In particular, the question of decision-making, right? Because if this was indeed one of the ultimate command decisions of World War II, and it completely changed the strategic complexion of the last year of the war, and it changed history in many ways, what went into that? Well, some of it might have been those intangibles, like Admiral Spruance, King, and Nimitz being on board the ship when all the flies came in the windows. And they started to think about the civilian casualties that were going to happen. But more, these guys were tough, right? This is World War II after all. More than that, it was the cold, hard numbers. So the Joint Chiefs of Staff were getting numbers in all the time. The things that they looked at were, what is the Japanese garrison? What are the numbers that they have? And those numbers kept going up and up and up. They were concerned about that. Other numbers were the numbers of divisions that would be available and the number of support troops that would be available for Operation Causeway. And as time went on and they could start to see they're not going to get all the resources that they needed, resources in terms of numbers of men, numbers of shipping, engineering support, logistics support. There's entire books that you can read that are like this thick, where you have Army engineering intelligence reports in support of Operation Causeway. They really got into the weeds on what it would require to pull this off. And they started to see the numbers just don't add up. That is a lot less comforting in the current context. What's also less comforting, so I mentioned that deterrent, it sounds great. It's a great talking point, right? Deterrence worked before, it can work again. Yeah, but I should add the caveat and the disclaimer that things are very different in the current environment. They're different in the sense that during World War II, our top commanders had options. Clearly they had options. They didn't have to take Taiwan. They could do Iwo Jima and Okinawa. They could have done other combinations. And they were gaming out other combinations of islands and other ways they could do this thing. When you read Xi Jinping's speeches and his internal writings, and especially there was a series of books that were were published. They're internal, but they were not classified, and they leaked out, and we can read some of them. These are books published and issued by Beijing's National Defense University on what does the boss say? What has Xi Jinping thought on becoming a superpower, what they call a strong military thought. That's a euphemism for a superpower. And one of the interesting things that has happened in China over the last, going on 15 years or so now, since the 18th Party Congress, is kids in China, from the time you're in elementary school, you start learning about Xi Jinping thought. Xi Jinping's worldview, his own personal political philosophy, all the way up to now college and grad school. You can get a PhD now in China in Xi Jinping thought. And a lot of people do. And you can imagine why. In a one-party dictatorship, when you have such a strong dictator, why you might want to do that. When you read his works, it is remarkable the way he talks about Taiwan. Because it's like he doesn't see any other path to greatness for China, the People's Republic of China, even Chinese civilization. He talks in this kind of blood nationalist terms of, in the blood of all true Chinese people, we have these aspirations. It's really chilling in a sense of how he talks about Taiwan and how Taiwan is the breakout point. How after they take over Taiwan, then they can really assert dominance over Asia and they can become this global force. And actually, Director Sharma's done really interesting research on what does it mean to be a global or a world-class Navy in the PLA's views. And a lot of it ties to this, because as long as Taiwan is there, the PLA Navy can't break out. Even to this day, it's still considered an unsinkable aircraft carrier, and it's on our side. It's on our defensive perimeter. So unless they can break through, they can't get out. And so the implications then are, in the perfect world, Taiwan would have a much larger ground force. So you could present Xi Jinping and his top commanders with much more favorable defensive ratios. For example, intangibles matter a great deal too. So for Spruance and Nimitz and all the commanders, they saw the way the Japanese held at Saipan. They saw what the shattered jade strategy would look like. And they knew that would be applied on Taiwan. That no one was ever going to give up, ever. And they were all in, all the way. And that shook them, I believe. That knowledge that your enemy will hit you with suicide attacks was just stunning. So after the war, Admiral Nimitz famously said that they war-gamed out everything that was going to happen in World War II correctly at the Naval War College when he was there as a student. So they anticipated in advance how the war would play out. But they didn't see the kamikazes coming. They didn't see shattered jade. They didn't see the way the human being lawnmower was going to happen, and they were going to just throw women and children and old people in there. They didn't see that. And it was just so shocking. And so the implication is, how do you communicate to Xi Jinping that the Taiwanese are willing to fight? How do you communicate to him that the Americans are willing to come to Taiwan's assistance? That's tough. And there are some significant headspace issues that we have and some policy issues that we have and that the Taiwanese have as well, especially when we are now in an environment where the bad guys are shaping the entire information space through things like TikTok and agents of influence and all kinds of nefarious things that they do to try to undermine and erode our will to resist, our will to stand up for democracy, for example, and Taiwan's will to do that. And so these are some of the intangibles as well. So there's the cold, hard numbers that matter a great deal, or at least they did historically for planners. The brutal realities of what you can and can't do over beaches, for example, or ports, the tonnage, some of those logistical calculations that still are really important for the PLA today, and we know because we can read some of their stuff. Director Sharman noted that study on amphibious warfare. Some of the chapters in that volume, that edited volume, some of us looked at some of these planning considerations that the PLA talks about. To this day, those cold, hard numbers still matter a great deal to them. And so do the intangibles when they think about things like, what is the Taiwanese will to resist? And this is something I think the soft community has a huge role to play in bucking up and training the Taiwanese. Because you guys are, the silverback gorillas in our arsenal. You're the ultimate secret weapon, what the Chinese would call a magic weapon. And when you roll in, it automatically, immediately just bolsters everybody's confidence. And so there have been some, what I believe to be strategic messages that have dropped in the media about the presence of advisors from the soft community in Taiwan. I think it's very thoughtful and very happy to see that kind of stuff go on. But the more that we can do to help train and educate, and in some cases indoctrinate, I think the better. Yes, sir.
I read an article probably about over a year ago, Wall Street Journal, regarding the Taiwanese elite and their avoidance of conscription, their children and whatnot, their attempts to avoid conscription. Do you think that's somewhat tied to the business ties that Taiwan has developed with mainland China over time? I mean, there's money that's flowing back and forth between those two, and
Sure
Foxconn's got plants over there and everything else. So I think Xi Jinping is looking at a soft takeover as much as he is as a hard takeover.
Yeah, absolutely. For me, as a guy who lived in Taiwan, studied there, did language training there, did grad school there, and have been back a lot for work and visiting all their military bases and meeting a lot of their senior leaders. We're really lucky now in the sense that I met Lee Deng-hui and Tsai Ing-wen and the current president of Taiwan and the current vice president and the national security advisor and the foreign minister, and they're a different breed from their predecessors. The DPP, the Green Party in Taiwan, which is a very Taiwan-centric. They get labeled Taiwan independence. They're not really, because they don't intend to change the name of the country or the flag or anything like that. But they're very Taiwan-centric. They're very patriotic. These guys are hardcore. I mean, their foreign minister, longtime foreign minister, now their national security advisor, Joseph Wu, he talks like Churchill. I mean, it's really, and he quotes Churchill. It's really remarkable. His son did his military service in the MPs. I know his son, and he did his service the hard way. Lai Ching-te, the current president of Taiwan, did his service the hard way out in Jinmen as well. Xiaobi Kim, who's Taiwan's vice president, who was Taiwan's de facto ambassador to the United States for a long time in Washington, D.C. You could go visit her at Twin Oaks there. What she would do on the weekends, just for fun, just because she could, is she would go out to the shooting range in Northern Virginia and just start popping them off and pretend it was Xi Jinping or pretend it was, invading PLA forces. So here's Taiwan's ambassador, who's very polished, very, very well educated, very sophisticated, but with that level of dedication to her country's national defense. And Joseph Wu, when he would do the special channel visits, the then foreign minister, kind of come in undercover to visit the United States, he would do the same thing. And he's got a big Twitter following. And so one time I forget if we were at dinner at his office, and he was talking about, here's a picture of us on the gun range in Northern Virginia. And when the strategic moment comes, I might just put this on social media so, the other side knows how dedicated we are to our defense. Okay, well, that's great. At the top levels, that's so important, right? But we also know the PLA has decapitation plans. In other words, plans to wipe out that top level, to cut off the head. So then you have to get into things like continuity of government. How good is their presidential security? How good is their leadership security? What might we do to augment that? And what about those guys that we know are in their parliament, the elite, who do have business ties in China? Because the previous KMT administration, from 2008 to 2016, when Mine Joe was president, it was pretty weird to meet with some of his national security guys, and you want to talk about the threat, you want to talk about red, and they don't want to talk about red. They don't want to talk about the threat. The only threat that they see is the threat of Taiwan declaring independence, and then they get a shellacking from China that they so richly deserve, because they believe, and this is a pretty small minority, but politically influential, they believe in some kind of amorphous one China, that one day in the distant future, the two sides will come together. It's kind of like on the Korean Peninsula, where you have the Ministry of Unification in Seoul, and you have a Ministry of Unification in North Korea, and they still think they're part of one broken family, that one day we'll get back together. Those guys for me personally, it's really troubling when you sit with them and you talk to them, how many of them have deep, deep ties to China. And then you see stuff that they start to pull when they get in positions of power in their parliament. For example, the current majority of Taiwan's parliament, their Congress, is controlled by the KMT and a coalition with the TPP. Those two political parties, in my view, have been really corrupted by Chinese Communist Party intelligence. And that's just my personal view, based on a lot of conversations with some of them and their staff, and listening to what they say, and even watching some leaked videos you can get of speeches they've given. And so this is a real problem.
They were in power for a long time. That's why they were targeted by the CCP.
They were.
Yeah.
And this happens to anybody who goes to China. If you go to China, if you do business with China, if you make it part of your career plan and your plan to success, to have access to China, they're on you. And they're collecting on you, and they get every little detail. And they have people that have PhDs in psycholinguistics, for example, who are figuring out what to say to you to change your behavior and to manipulate you. This is no joke. They're what they call political warfare, which is a combination of media warfare, propaganda warfare, legal warfare, and psychological warfare. This is an entire wing of the PLA that all they do is basically a gigantic strategic psyop, giant strategic covert operations to influence their enemies and to crumble their enemies' will to resist. We don't have anything like that. We never have. Democracies tend not to do this kind of thing. You might have very, very small specialized units, but on a massive scale, they have an entire wing of their military that does this. And they're very well resourced and well trained. So if you look at the 311 unit, for example, in Fuzhou across the Taiwan Strait, and what was their strategic support force, it's pretty remarkable stuff they've done. And in the think tank world, you can read some of the reports that have been done on these guys. It's really remarkable. And you guys would appreciate this way more than your average warrior would, is that when you fight the PLA, you get in the ring with a guy and you see him, right? This is how we think of war. And you start to slug it out with him. What if there's another guy in the ring and you don't see him because he's completely invisible to you, and then he starts to sucker punch you and you don't even know where he is. You don't see him. That's how the PLA won the Chinese Civil War. The Chinese Civil War started in 1927. It was an underground movement to overthrow the government and to take everything over. It was an intelligence battle. They didn't win until 1949. How did they win? It wasn't really until 1947 that they started to field gigantic field armies with multiple corps, with huge numbers of tanks, and conducting large-scale traditional operations. That whole time, though, they were working underground. They were working undercover. And they got very, very good at it. And so there's some interesting studies you can read now that the Office of Net Assessment, for example, have done. Toshi Yoshihara, as one of my favorite people, he's done some awesome work on this history of how the PLA goes about waging war. And this is how they do it. So we're fighting the PLA. We're fighting the PLA that we can see that looks like us, does the same kinds of things that we do, but we're also fighting another entire wing of the PLA that's very different. And they do things very differently, and they are actively preparing the battle space. And so we have to get much smarter on that and prepare for that as well.
I think that brings us to the end.
Okay.
So one more round of applause for me.
Thank you, sir.
Wonderful.